Welcome to the Designing Hollywood podcast in association with the John Campea Show. I am your host, Robert Meyer Burnett. The Designing Hollywood podcast show is dedicated to all things movies, the movie industry, and its talented professionals.
Hi, I'm Gilbert Musali, the new president and CEO of Western Costume, welcoming Designing Hollywood back to Western. You're at the biggest costume house in the U.S., the oldest costume house in the U.S. We've been around over 112 years now. We consider ourselves the one-stop shop for all your costuming needs here. With our two extra buildings next door, we're at roughly around 150,000 square feet. There are roughly 2.5 million costumes. If you need to get supplies, we can help you with that. If you need fabric, we can help you with that. Order fabric from around the world, anywhere you need. Deck out a full army if you want in our military department. Here's our supply store, catering to all your costuming needs. Thank you, Designing Hollywood, for coming in to see Western Costume. Hope to see you soon.
Today's guest is a costume designer for film and television. She received a Costume Designers Guild Excellence in Contemporary Film nomination for her design work on Bridesmaids, directed by Paul Feig, and most recently a Fantasy and Sci-fi Emmy nomination for LOKI Season 1, directed by Kate Herron. Her versatile aesthetic has served Cameron Crowe for his contemporary series ROADIES to the pilot of the futuristic series Altered Carbon, directed by Miguel Sapochnik. She's worked with Taika Waititi on the series adaptation of the bestseller book Interior Chinatown, written by Charles Yu, and has recently completed the highly anticipated Season 2 of LOKI. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome costume designer Christine Wada to the Designing Hollywood show. Christine, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great.
exciting.
It's great. You know, it's what I love to do is look at everybody's credits before I interview them. And as I was saying before we started, you have worked with Spielberg, the Coen brothers, Cameron Crowe, who directed Almost Famous, which is one of my most favorite movies of all time. And you were coming up, you were working as a costumer on those shows, which was an amazing, I would imagine, education. How did you find yourself in this business of Hollywood, and how did you become a costumer? Was it something that you dreamt of doing when you were a kid?
I really think it was these incredible mentors that I had that dragged me into this profession. But if I look back with an adult eye, I went to art school. I was a painting major. I gravitated towards painting people. I loved character. And I love, are we freezing? Sorry. Are you frozen? Are you
No,
there?
no,
Okay.
no, we're good.
Okay. Okay. And so when I graduated college, I was introduced to Carol Ramsey, who is still an incredible costume designer, and she just brought me into this magical world that sort of combined all these different passions of mine. It worked out perfectly. I very lucky. And then Mary Zofries also
Mm.
Nurtured a real path and an approach to design for me. And so between those two people, I think I have a pretty excellent pedigree.
It's interesting for me with costume designers, there's sort of two different tracks. Some people were like making clothes for their dolls when they were kids and always wanted to go into costume design. But then there's others that went the art school, more academic route and found their way into costume design. I love the fact that you were a figure painter. How do you think that a formal art education affects your design work? Because a lot of people tell me that they go to art galleries and look at frescoes from the 15th century to see how light played off fabric as interpreted by the artists back in those days. Do you think that having an academic background is something that's essential, and has it helped you moving forward in your career?
I think for my process, it's been vital because so many approaches to the creative process are similar. So through an education, I've learned to create and build an outline for whether I'm painting a
Mm,
final painting, or if you're, say, writing a book, you create an outline, which I think in costumes and in terms of specifically my approach to costumes, uh, building out that world and creating your zones is uh, really a vital part of how I like to work and come up with ideas. And then that my education being in painting or has really facilitated that, uh, that progression, let's
sure.
say, has necessarily facilitated that. And also, by the way, I think color palette is such a huge part of costume design and storytelling that having that background has been incredible resource.
Were you a fan of, did you watch a lot of movies growing up? And did you have, like, Edith Head, obviously, was the first costume designer I'd ever heard of. Were you a fan of films, and what were some of your cinematic influences, if you had any?
Well, what's interesting is I grew up not really being allowed to watch television or
Okay.
see that much of media, but I think I'm very much a child of the 70s. So there are movies, 60s and 70s movies that are very deep in my psyche. And I'd say, yeah, Kubrick being one of the first, I think that I gravitated first filmmakers I ever gravitated towards. And maybe that is just because by nature, maybe I have a very voyeuristic eye. And and I also really loved all of the blow up Warhol and then Warhol
Yeah,
making
so Antonioni and
all of that. So yes, but I'd say it's strange and a little embarrassing at times to say that I don't have this huge film catalog, and it translates into how I do research for costumes because I tend to gravitate towards real life for reference or art or photography
sure.
more than I do film as my reference point.
Were you a fan? Did you have like I'm a big fan of like Toshin's books on photography, and did you have photographers that influenced you along with, like you were talking about, the
Yes,
like I'm a huge Antonioni fan too, and all that stuff, whether it was Godard, Truffaut, Antonioni and his Ennui
right.
trilogy, but were there photographers of that era, because there was so much great photography going on at the same time?
I love like Danny Lyons. I love Sally Mann. I love really honestly like all the Magnum photographers, all
Right.
the people represented by Magnum, which is really a little grittier and a little bit more geared towards journalism or street photography. But I've always tracked those careers.
Right.
So,
Well, when you were in art school, how did
uh,
how did you make that transition? I mean, everyone's like, I want to go to Hollywood and work in the business. And you said you had these mentors. Where was that? How did you go from being a painter to jumping into the industry?
being poor. Being poor. I was trying to get government grants for painting murals in LA when I had just moved here from New York. And
Mm.
I think that I was assisting somebody painting a mural down at the Greyhound bus station for $5 an hour. And somebody I went to art school with said, "Hey, um, my sister is assistant designer on this movie. Do you want to go pack boxes for $150 a day or something? Whatever. I think it was 100." I was like, yes, $100 a day. But anyhow, what was interesting is, like I said, that I was influenced by a lot of 60s and 70s sort of mod culture. The movie that I packed boxes on was Dragon Life of Bruce Lee that Carol Ramsey designed.
And
And
Rob
there was
Cohen directed.
uh-huh, yes. And there was a party 60s, swinging 60s party scene, and they didn't have enough help. And she asked me to jump in. And I knew that era so well. and then she asked me to assist her.
What a cool movie too to be on. That actually that's a great. I love that movie. On that set, what was it that struck you the most that was surprising to you about filmmaking that you might not have considered until you were actually on set dressing people and watching the technicians work?
Hmm. I think that it probably would have been just the amount of teamwork that it takes. I think you just sort of assume that it's a few people filming things, and it's just this very fluid, and especially coming from a painting background where it's just you're so
Right.
independent. I had no idea at the timing of I think what was so surprising is to see how much technical and organizational element there is to filmmaking.
Right.
You just think
Right.
magic when you're watching it just magically happens.
But were you
It's
like
just
bitten by the bug? Were you like, okay, I'm doing this. I'm gonna pivot. No more painting. I'm gonna go work in film.
I think it took me a couple films to really say that. It did. I really definitely just to be completely transparent, it took me a minute, but because I wasn't really sure that I wanted to deal with all that technical side and especially at that young, very arty stage in your life.
Sure.
What do you mean I have to worry about money?
Well, now I'm curious. Once you started to get into it and you were a costumer and then you became an assistant designer, did you feel that that art education, your background as a painter, gave you a leg up working in costume design?
Absolutely. Yes, it did. Um I think another fun assistant designer story is that I was hired on Beloved to be a costumer for Colleen Atwood.
Ooh,
Yeah. And
going right into the legends.
right, and I can't remember if I think I was hired, like, to do background fittings or maybe it was pulling costumes, I can't quite remember, and I one day, there was a Colleen didn't like the way that certain dyeing was coming out, like fabric dyeing was coming out, and she just asked me to try it, and I, by the way, had no background in the technical side of dyeing, but I have a very good eye for color, and, the next I did it. I just did it by gut. I dyed this fabric, and the next thing I knew, Colleen asked me to just start doing all the dyeing, aging and dyeing on that.
Well,
So, yes,
okay,
my art background had definitely,
paid off.
set into yeah.
Well, Beloved was directed by Jonathan Demme. So
Mhm.
immediately, Academy Award winning director. I mean, he'd made Philadelphia, he'd made Silence of the Lambs. Were you
Yeah.
ever intimidated by all the talent that you were suddenly surrounded by? Or did it just not register like they're just your coworkers?
Just didn't really register.
Right.
Didn't really
Because you went straight to the top. Like you didn't like work your way up through these, low budget indie things for $150,000. You know,
It's true, but believe it or not, Dragon at that time, because during that era in the early '90s, those were these really big budget, non-union movies.
right.
That was
Yeah.
they're not so, but you do I think I'm very fortunate to have grown up in that era, and yes, I did start it on these incredible projects, but you really did all of the department back then. Like, at
Right.
most people I mean, I would I watched all of my mentors, uh, aging shoes, doing, background a couple background fittings. I mean, it was just you did everything back then, so it was an incredible education.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I began doing the same. I worked in the art department. I was a PA, and you
yeah,
learned a million different things that you didn't know. And I always recommend that people now are like, well, I want to be a producer. I'm like, you should go be a PA first. Work your way, because you need to know obviously how a set works. And I just look at your rise. I mean, going from you worked on so many films that had cool clothing, like the Coen brothers. Their films, whether it was "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," there's a texture and a quality I'm a huge fan of their movies, and the clothes are so important in their particular films. And when you work for the Coen brothers, did you get a sense of that? Like, were they particularly involved in costuming, and if so, what was that like to work on the Coen brothers movies?
Well, I was working for Mary Zofries at that time, so really everything was a through line through her incredible process and thinking of her approach to costumes, right? So I can only speak to it from that perspective
Sure.
through assisting her, and I just their attention and her attention to character first. I think I will always take um, as a much bigger education all the way through my career, because
Right.
I think it is um, the most important thing. And I also think in their movies and Mary's approach to costumes, it's learning when co- how to make things appear uh, seamless and not distracting. So sometimes there's a lot of work in costumes to make something actually not jump out at you,
Right.
to make it so believable that you don't even notice the costumes. And that, I think, is just as hard to achieve, if not harder,
Mm.
than um, something really overly stylized. And I think that that's part of the charm of those movies is it gets paced really well. I think I do several reads of the script. I just read it casually first to just get a feel for it, and then I read it for character stuff, and then I read it for costumes. Right, so uh, everything to me starts tonally from the pages,
Mm.
and then in terms of then I start to do references from there, and then you have your fitting with the actors. And I think it's really important to remember that costumes is the first phase of production for all actors.
Yep.
So it's very important that obviously I've spoken to the director at that point, and but it's really important that you've thought of the whole arc of the character, and that really, if you think about it, it comes from the writing. You have to extrapolate that from the pages. Um, and it really then crystallizes as a visual that is sincere, I think.
Yeah, I mean, often I've told people that hair and makeup and costume design are some of the most important, your key players, because you want your actors not to worry about any of those things. When they step out onto stage, they have to know
Right.
that they embody that character, and the way they look is such an integral part of that.
Yes.
Do you like working with actors?
I love working with actors. I really do. I I think there's several approaches to it. I personally really like to work closely with an actor because it's very important that they're comfortable in the clothes, that it
Mm.
really helps them find their character. So it doesn't, because I don't want a costume to look like a costume, essentially, unless it calls for it in the story. I'd
Sure.
really like to feel as a second skin to the actor, and then to help them find find their tone. Um, I think it was interesting. Taika had said, I don't know, in some interview for Our Flag Means Death, he was doing Thor at the time and had to come to LA to start shooting Our Flag Means Death like 2 days before he started shooting. Never really had a fitting for him. I built this stuff, did illustrations, built this stuff for him. He walks into the room, he puts on the clothes, and that is when everything just pays off to see find his character and come to life, because he is such an incredibly expressive human being, and uses every tool to find magic in his characters, I'd
Sure.
say. It was really a special moment where you see that costumes can be a, just a, just a manual for an actor.
Yeah. Well, when you made the transition and became a costume designer, I love the diversity of the projects that you were you were involved with, because you would go from something like, I love that you worked on Roadies and The Dirt. You know, you get your rock and roll yah-yahs out, but then before you worked on Loki, you went to the DC side of things and worked on Constantine,
Yeah.
and which is, again, and of course, Bridesmaids, hilarious. I mean, that movie is jaw-droppingly funny. And even Redline. I'm a fan of
Yeah.
Redline.
Yeah.
What did you, now that you were taking over and you were now calling the shots, how did your job change from going to working for somebody to now people working for you? Did it change drastically, or were you able to take things that you'd learned and create, like, how did you create your own process and your own workflow as a full-on costume designer when you were in charge? How did that change for you?
Very interesting question. How did it change? I'd say, I mean, to before I get to the change, I will say that having done every part of the department really helped me
Mm,
to, it didn't feel like this massive leap to become the head of the department because I kind of knew what everybody did. So it was much easier to organize the team and know what my expectations of the team should be, um, because I had done all the different corners of the department. But
right.
I would say, wow. I mean, what changed for me is uh, really sticking to the vision and getting out of the organizational part as much, and just learning how to like organize. And I would say mainly what changed for me is prep, is learning how to really prep something properly. Um, and that is probably the biggest change that happens as a costume designer, is learning how to properly really prep something.
Right. Interesting. So before we get directly into Loki, like, I'm obviously, as you can tell, I'm a huge science fiction, fantasy, horror fan. And you worked on things like Altered Carbon, you worked on Zombieland, you worked on Constantine, like we talked about, and even Pixels, which was that's a wacky film too. Do you have a different approach when you're working on, say, genre material, um, or fantasy work, as opposed to doing something like recreating for the dirt, like when you're doing something that's based on real people, as opposed to uh, total flights of fantasy, like Altered Carbon was? Does
Uh-huh.
your approach change?
The approach does change, because there's a tactile element to world building. So there is this incredible world of R&D
Right.
that
Okay.
I really love to dive into when I'm doing fantasy, sci-fi, or period, actually, because you're kind of organizing so many more elements. Whereas I'd say when you're doing something like The Dirt, it's organizing what you have historically as reference, and then kind of figuring out how that fits into the script.
Hmm.
And you're not quite as tactile, even though you're still paying attention to things as such as color palette, or uh, just silhouettes, right? Which happens in across the board. There just isn't that same tactile element, the
Right.
R&D that happens in fantasy, sci-fi, and period.
Well, so obviously, I'm a huge fan of the MCU. Growing up reading the comics and being familiar with, and when I saw Iron Man 1, I was blown away by actually just how good it was. And what I loved was it's a character study. The first Iron Man movie is about a man who discovers his conscience. And then watching how the Marvel movies evolved, I would say the 23 movies of the Infinity Saga are probably the greatest achievement in fantasy filmmaking ever, of all time.
Right.
That said, when you're jumping in, dealing with one of those key players, Tom Hiddleston is Loki. Were you at all intimidated jumping into the Marvel fray? when and how did you find yourself working for Marvel and working on Loki? How did that come about?
A classic interview, an old school interview that I succeeded at and I did a presentation for. And I think because I don't, and yes, by the way, very intimidating, mainly because I don't have a catalog brain for the Marvel universe. So it
Sure.
felt intimidating on that level alone. And also just the scale of like, uh, of their projects and the world building. And there were so many worlds to build in that first season of Loki, and even the second season. We're going into periods, but still creating it within the Loki vibe, right? So, but it was. Um, sorry, go back to the original question again.
Well, just jumping in to after you got the interview,
Yeah,
just you
like,
pretty much answered it. But I was going to ask because of all of the Marvel projects from a costume design standpoint, Loki's just wacky because of all the different things that you get to do, and from the Time Variance Authority to He Who Remains to Jonathan Majors, what he was and how he changed through both seasons, and then all the different costume changes everybody went through. When you started on the project, were you like or did you just dive right in?
I did. I had to dive right in because, but in getting the job, I had done so much research and I so knew what my point of view was going to be, and luckily, um, right when I started, I met with the production designer, Kate Herron, and the Kevin Wright, uh, and it was incredible because we all had kind of the same research, right? So Kevin really assembled the right people, and we all had read the script and seen it in the same way. And I will say also that Michael Waldron gave us a really great, some really um, tonally, the writing major imagination, think of where it could go, and then luckily it just happened that we assembled this team that was just so in sync. Um, but yes, I had to dive right in, and it is an outlier show, I think for
Yeah,
sure. And
100%.
I don't know how we had such luck at just really staying on track and not getting pulled off of our mission of how the show should be, and that the sort of bucking against the sci-fi and keeping it analog, and just we did a lot in camera
Yeah.
instead of which I think makes the show also feel a little different because there's a real um, communal effort to keep pushing towards as many things in camera as possible.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that watching like WandaVision, which was the first Marvel series, I was blown away by that because it kind of took a whole different tactic. I mean, recreating the different eras of sitcoms and things like that, and Loki kind of did the same thing where it was not. I mean, the rest of the MCU is trying to ground superheroics in kind of the real world, whereas like WandaVision and especially Loki, you guys got to take us to some Brazil, like the Time Variance Authority, and you're going to the void at the end. And I mean, suddenly Richard E. Grant shows up as classic Loki, one of my favorite actors of all time. And I have to say that the influences that you guys all brought together, what were some of the things that you were looking, because obviously we've heard a lot about how Marvel has its design division. They're doing a lot of
Mhm.
design work way in advance of anything
Sure.
getting made. But once you had all that, you guys really went to town, and all the different variations of Loki costumes, and even what Tom Hiddleston got to wear, whether the different, and Sylvie and all of that. Take us through that process and tell us kind of, it must have been pretty damn fun to work on that show.
Oh, so fun. It becomes this sort of, it was a banter. I feel like we were able to have a banter with the studio the whole time and just bounce ideas around. And so, for instance, the TVA is not exactly what they had drawn, but we did this sort of it just we were really able to just go out and go out on these limbs and state our case and win it and get the trust of the studio, which was um I think like I said, I think it's because it was a pretty cohesive vision,
Right. And it could have gone
right?
off the rails, but
It
it
could have
doesn't.
got
You guys were all
cohesive, and I think it kept it all the way through, which kind of goes back to the beginning of our interview about just creating your research and your template, which
mm,
is why it's such an important part of any creative process, I
yeah,
think.
no, 100% is now when you've got there's a Loki alligator at one point, in the void. I mean, you're dealing with all the different variants of Lokis, I mean, were you given a little bit of leeway, carte blanche, to sort of go on and go, what is this Loki gonna look like?
Well, they have like classic Loki and Kid Loki. Those were kind of based
The
in their
comics.
the comics, their biz dev, but then it was just like go bonkers on um, whatever else you want. So I was just picking places and historical like uh, mysteries, like the Fabergé egg. I would base things around like the lost Fabergé egg. I was just digging for things that were like lost in moments in history or a character that just maybe got stuck in a particular time. Or like Kate Herron and I both really love animals, and there is in the comics Loki. It kept going around that Loki, maybe we should make in the void a version where he's wearing that classic the wolf head coat. But I
Right.
just not wrap my head around, nor could Kate, around really having him wear like dead animals. And even if you do it fake, it would just be so dark to look at. A little too Game of Thrones, maybe.
Right.
And right.
Little Jon
And
Snow.
yeah, exactly. And so so I made uh like an ironic sort of 90s wolf howling at the moon t-shirt that one of the right. So it was just fun. We got to really like play around with uh constructs.
Now, when you're working on a show like that, obviously you're playing in the extended Marvel Cinematic Universe, and at the time, I mean, now the TVA has become obviously the TVA has a presence in the upcoming Deadpool and Wolverine. Um,
Well,
did you, when you're working within the confines, did you have to be aware that you're setting up something that could have larger ramifications moving forward in projects you're not going to be involved with? Like, you're now setting the tone for what the TVA is going to be like for the next 10 years, 15 years. Did you have to, was that part of your thought process, or when you guys were working, like you were working with Kate, um, or not? Did you just figure like, we're just going to
no,
concentrate on what we're doing now. We don't have to worry about anybody else.
I just concentrated on what we were doing. But you're always having check-ins with the studio. There's always these that like I said, these banters. So
Right.
they it's Oz. Oz definitely has, they know what's coming down the road. So I just focused solely on what was best for Loki.
Right. Well, I have to say, like I was
Yeah.
saying, this company, this toy company that Hot Toys makes these, and they've done so many different Lokis, the latest being God Loki. And you
Yes.
kind of, if you know the comics, where that, I loved that final iteration, when you see him, that, I mean, it was, how much of that was practical and how much of
A lot.
that was it, because it's an amazing, I mean, that image of him is awesome. And was that, I mean, obviously you do have, there is a lot of comic stuff you're drawing from, but what was it like to create something like that? That final image, of God Loki.
Well, thanks for asking because I do think that that it often gets overlooked how hard it is to make so much of that work in a practical
Yeah.
sense, right? And especially a cape, because a cape tends to really not do well under a wind machine. So, but I would really wanted to have it work practically. Um, but so yeah, that whole it wasn't that that costume was based in, once again, it kind of came off the page because I knew he needed to sort of go back to his God status, but he needed to be humble.
Right.
And but
Okay.
it needed, so there were so many um, things it had to convey through tonally, right? Uh, and so building it, I don't. It was funny the first time that I met Tom, probably like for the second season. I don't know, probably 8 months or something before we started, or
Wow.
6 months maybe before we started shooting. Sorry, ever since COVID, terrible sense of time.
Yeah.
So maybe like 6 months before. But I just wanted him to try on a light, ethereal, sort of flowing fabric, and going back to what it's like to work with incredible actors. It was just one of those things where you put it on and we instantly knew it was right because it made him behave exactly what we were saying. It was just like humble but regal. Um, and it just, yeah, it's like we nailed it in the beginning.
When you're on a show like Loki, do you keep in touch or do you keep close, like you talked about working with Kate, but also your director of photography in terms of color palette and deciding, like, are you testing fabrics with the camera department to see what they look like under certain lighting conditions before you actually go and make something
Yes.
practically?
Yes. Huge. It's huge. In fact, I think I ran out to Panavision a billion times on
Wow.
the first season to just test, because that fabric, the TVA fabric and Tom's fabric and Owen's fabric is this 1960s, like a sharkskin suiting.
Right.
Um, and I wanted to see, and also I had really pushed for the brown color, and I knew that the TVA would have a lot of brown in it, and
Mm.
so I wanted to test how that would look, because uh, right, whether it was too matchy to the background or if it could just pop a little bit, because that fabric had sort of a green cast to it as well. But
Mm.
yes, fabric all the time, and it helps. On the second season, we did a pretty extensive camera test, and Isaac adjusted the LUT because it was kind of killing the orange, and orange being such a vital part of the TVA. So,
Sure.
yes, we camera test a lot.
Well,
Yes.
that brings up another question. I was going to ask you this. Now that I remember to ask you this, you actually saw the transition between shooting on film and then shooting digitally during the time of your career.
Yeah.
How, and now most things are digitally captured. Quentin Tarantino will still shoot on film, Christopher Nolan will still shoot on film, but really the transition has been made to digital. How did that affect costuming? And in terms of materials, because obviously you can see things when you digitally capture at these higher resolutions, and obviously the art department has to worry what they used to do for scenic painting. They could make a wall look like it was concrete. It doesn't always work as well as it used to because digital is so. How has the transition from film to digital affected your work, or has it?
Oh, it's huge. It's hugely affected my work, and it's still something that I feel like I'm always experimenting and playing with to get it better and better, because aging is definitely a problem,
Mm,
um, especially when lighting sources change. You go from an interior to an exterior, all those old rules don't apply. The
right.
one thing that I really have learned is that um, is to choose fabrics with texture in them, and to also that it's like you used to be able to paint in a lot of um, shadow and age, but now it kind of ends up looking painted and in a weird way makes it look more flat. So you sort of need to manipulate and choose your fabrics wisely, because if your fabrics can pick up shadow or texture, then that's the most organic way to deal with aging and to just make things not feel too flat in general, or
Sure.
oh, right? But I would say it's a ongoing learning curve, um, going to digital.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, another thing I love about the MCU is, I think, in terms of the translation from the page to the movie screen or the TV screen, the the costuming, the superhero costuming has been exemplary across the board. They've made
Yeah.
things modern, but they're still very redolent of the origins of the characters. They're always recognizable. They don't, like when the first X-Men movie came out in 2000, the X-Men were all clad in black leather. And it made
Right.
sense because it was like their mission. But Marvel has never done that. Marvel's been like, no. I mean, that was Fox. Now it's all under the same thing. But you guys really, you go for the color. You know, you're not afraid. The MCU is not afraid to embrace color. I mean, Loki's more muted because he's black and greens and things like that. But are there certain shades of green that you have to use to keep it along? I mean, is there like a color palette mandate at all when you're working on an MCU project? Because you have to use a certain green. I don't know. I'm just curious. I've always wondered that.
I think it's probably different from project to project.
Mm,
On Loki, um, there was definitely a room to explore
okay.
different shades, for sure. But it's also just aesthetics at a certain point, right? And what's going to read and what is. I mean, it would be very weird if all of a sudden Loki was in a chartreuse green, right? So there is kind of
Although I'd
just,
watch that.
yeah, maybe next time. I mean, I guess in a weird way, classic Loki has that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
and in a way, I mean, it's funny because, like we are talking about, that toy company is making classic Loki, so you can get the Richard E. Grant version of classic Loki, and
oh,
yeah,
oh,
yeah. I mean, and that's the funny thing is, I talk to these costume designers, and behind me in this studio, I'm like, oh, you made all these different people. I have Loki. I don't have God Loki yet because they haven't made, but I've purchased it. It just hasn't arrived. So to talk to you, it's like, yeah, well, I've got this. It'll be on my shelf soon.
well,
Um,
wait, I'm looking around. I'm looking back there.
yeah, I mean, these are the Marvel characters are mostly all over there because I've got a big display case with all of the
Prince.
of that.
Is
Yeah,
that
that's
Prince?
yep. This is my rock band. So there's Freddie
Oh,
Mercury, Bowie, Jimi Hendrix,
yeah.
Prince, uh, John Lennon. This is Eric Draven, the Crow, from the movie The
Yep.
Crow, because it just came out for its 30th anniversary, and he came with a guitar, so I had him join the band.
Wow.
So it's just a fun thing to have. But so the thing about what I think is really interesting about Marvel is each, especially the TV shows, the streaming shows, have had their own identity. And I think that Loki has the most identity in terms of all your design work, everything from the influences of like Brazil, Terry Gilliam's Brazil with the TVA and all the stuff. It seems to me like Loki, working on Loki, had to have been, I think, more than just in terms of the creativity that you all brought to it, had to have been the most fun Marvel project to work on from a design standpoint because you had so much to do. And if that's the case, did you have favorite designs that you guys had come up with that maybe we don't know? Like, what are some of your favorite things that you made for Loki, that aside from like the obvious things? Is there like you were talking a little bit about putting stuff in the void that like the animals, but what was some of your most favorite things to make for Loki?
Hmm. I mean, I there was in season 2, um, General Docs has these embroidered ti timekeeper heads on her uniform, and I have to say that it was um, I just loved there's so many little fine craft details that are in season 2 that
Right.
maybe aren't really seen because they're so small, but they make it special in my eyes. And also it's funny, like nobody really wants to talk about the temporal core suit in season 2, but that was really fun because it was fun to take something, like Marvel. If you think of all, or not Marvel, just any superhero, it's always about how can you make something functional, like really work so the actor can jump and
Right.
fight through the air, and this was just the polar opposite. It was, how can I make something so awkward that it makes the character struggle and fight against the costume. That was really fun.
Wow.
That was Yeah, but I mean, they still have to move around, but yes, to try to figure that out, uh, was a whole new challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, it's a fantastic show. Now, and I love the work that you guys did. You know, I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question. But because in the trailers for Deadpool and Wolverine, we do see the TVA. Um, might you have anything that appears in that movie?
Oh.
I know we got people on publicity. If they don't like your answer, I'll have to cut it out.
You know what? I don't It's just, they use the template, I think. I don't
Right. Because
We'll see. You'll have
I can't wait. But, I figured I'd ask because I'd be remiss
Yeah.
if I think it's everybody's most eagerly awaited movie of the summer, judging by the
Exciting.
pre-sales.
Yes.
But I think
Yes.
it's cool they leaned into the TVA, that we're going to see that TV, because you guys obviously did a good enough job with everything that you did that made it very appealing, obviously,
Yeah.
to go further on that. Now, do you
And I
have? Oh, so
and
go ahead.
we introduced Brown to the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Which is probably that's no mean feat. I mean, that's
Uh, yeah.
congratulations on that.
Yeah. Thank
And popularizing. I mean, I'm sure like UPS is going to be like, we looked at this time variance authority.
Yeah.
Maybe we should look at our delivery. Well, we always ask people on this show for anybody up and coming designers or people that are interested in getting into design. Is there any advice you can give to people in this day and age about how they, if they're interested in pursuing a career in costume design, what they might do? What would you tell the new generation?
Well, like we were talking about before, I would say really know the full department, but in specific to costumes, I think lear really paying attention to the character side of
Mm,
costumes, is vital, and I sometimes wonder if that is, not considered when people are entering into costume design because they think it's going to be about shopping or fun clothes. And I think if I could just emphasize that the long haul joy of costumes to me is really developing a character and really enjoying that time that just percolates between reading a script and visualizing how that will manifest itself in costumes. I think that that percolation's like not to be overlooked or to be skipped over. Like really enjoy that time.
A question I didn't ask you was: do you do paintings of your designs before you make them? Do you do you draw? Because you do have that art background?
Yes, do a lot of sketch. Unfortunately, now I'm so busy that I don't really get to do the fun,
Mm.
really beautiful finished sketches, but I do the gestural just to get a silhouette, a color, an idea down. Then I might jump to having to do very technical drawings, like just how do we actually make this? Those drawings. Like, wait a minute, how do we make it? How did they get into it?
Right.
Those 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 drawings, which are really not pretty, but so I think I go from a very gestural drawing to the technical drawing. I
Wow.
don't get to do all pretty fancy drawing anymore. Plus, I'm old school. I still use watercolor. So,
Do you have anything upcoming that you can talk to us about?
I can't.
Well, but you have something upcoming. Well, we will eagerly await that. I want to thank you very much for being here on the Designing Hollywood podcast. This is great. It was great to talk to you. A great conversation, and I thought Loki season 2, you guys really knocked it out of the park, and so many interesting designs and things. So it was a lot of fun.
Great.
So, and I'm a big fan of all your work. So, Christine, thank you very much for being here, and thank you for being on the Designing Hollywood show.
Thank you for having me.
A special thank you to founder and executive producer Martika Ibarra, co-founder, costume designer, the legendary Marilyn Vance, and of course, John Campea from the John Campea Show. Thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Tune in to the audio version wherever you listen to podcasts. I am, of course, your host, Robert Meyer Burnett, and you can find me on Instagram at rmburnett, or find me on Twitter at BurnettRM, or on YouTube at Post Geek Singularity. Thanks very much. Like, subscribe, and give us your comments. What would you like to see on the channel? Right down below. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you on the next episode of Designing Hollywood.